Hello, Big Turbo GT here, coming to you with part two of Brandon's tech tips on the Mazda GD chassis. For one, I want to start with the exhaust manifold bolts. From the factory, they come with studs, but oftentimes the studs and nuts get seized together to where when you back out the bolt to take the exhaust manifold off the first time while owning the car, or the first time in its life in a lot of cases, you have the stud come out of the head. Well, what's going to happen is you're going to think, oh, well, I need to replace that with a bolt. Problem is the head is aluminum. So when you replace it with a bolt, every time you run that bolt in and out, if the head's remotely warm or a different temperature each time, it's going to cause galling on the bolt, which is where little shards of aluminum get caught on the bolt and that rips out the threads of the aluminum. So you can only take the bolts in and out of the aluminum head so many times before the threads are stripped and you have to drill and tap them. So the solution is to buy aftermarket exhaust studs. I think they're M8 by 1.25, I'm not positive. And just run studs in there with red Loctite, a lot of red Loctite. And just make sure that you use anti-seize or corrosion resistance on your bolts to where they won't rust to the stud, or just get stainless studs. I like to do that. It eliminates that problem. The second thing would be, sorry, hold on, putting a cigarette out here. The second thing I want to talk about in this episode would be the intake manifold bolts. It's the same thing. You want to use the studs. You want to avoid using bolts. If you can stud all of them, that's the best thing that you can possibly do. The third thing, and this is to do with the drivetrain, and it causes a lot of different problems, is get your car aligned and make sure that your wheel bearings, your ball joints, and tie rod ends are all in good shape, because when they go out of whack, you get a lot of wheel hop and it just destroys the whole drivetrain of these cars. Now, with the mechanical side of things, I've told you how it goes. If you can replace your valve cover bolts with studs as well, I would do that. I'd stud the whole head, because eventually you're going to have stripped bolts and it's a complete pain in the ass to deal with when it happens. So that's what I would do for that. And then, sorry about that, some crappy camera work. The next thing that I would say would be leaks. The whole damn car leaks. All the probes, and the 626 and MX6 aren't as bad as the probe, but especially the Ford Probe GT, they leak everywhere. The best thing you can do is reseal the car. You reseal the tail lights, you redo all the weather stripping, reseal the windshield, and that'll eliminate 90% of leaks that cause moldy interior, puddles of water in your car, wiring issues, all sorts of stuff. Because that leaking will eventually cause gremlins. It almost always does. Another thing, I see a lot of threads, and I've had a lot of problems myself with breaking lower speedometer cables. They break right at the speed sensor. Well, I figured out that that's because these are a non-lubed speedometer cable, so you have to use graphite lube when you install them, or else they bind up and it causes the cable to snap. I went through 3 or 4 cables before I figured that out. Kind of aggravated me because those cables aren't cheap. They're about 45 bucks a piece. So in the future, if you've had speedometer cable breaking issues, the end that goes into the speed sensor that connects at the tranny with the 10mm bolt, you want to lube that with graphite lube, and you want to clean the old stuff out first, because I guarantee you there's gritty dirt and different stuff in there that'll cause binding. You want that to be packed full of graphite lube and you'll be good to go. You won't break speedometer cables anymore. Another common issue that people don't understand is on cold starts having flooding and no start conditions and the car running really crappy when it's cold. Check your coolant temperature sensor. You want to ohm it out. Okay, there's a certain specification for ohms when it's cold and a certain specification of ohms for when it's at operating temperature. It needs to be within range on both of those readings. I can't remember what it was. I think it's something like 4,000 ohms cold, 80,000 hot, or excuse me. I don't know. I don't want to just throw numbers out there, but it's easy. You just Google it and you can figure it out. Another issue with these cars is the factory shifter has a tendency to be really sloppy because the bushings go bad. What I did was I found the solid metal inserts for the transmission side and then used a Honda Civic, I think it was an EG short shifter, a short throw billet shifter with washers on the bearing to space it out, and that made that solid as well. So now I have an almost completely solid shifter linkage, which helps a lot with bending the third gear shift fork, which is another common issue with the Mazda H series trans, which is why a lot of cars are really hard to go into third. It's not usually synchros, it's actually the shift fork getting bent. The next thing I'm going to talk about is something that if you haven't had this issue, you eventually will, and that is the shift gate inside of the transmission. They have a tendency to come loose. The reason being is because they were little tiny M6, I believe, bolts or M8 bolts um, that are ran right into the case of the transmission that attach the shift gate. Well, the problem is from the factory, they're only torqued 8 foot-pounds and they have no Loctite. So those over time work their way out, and then the shift gate either breaks or it comes loose and you lose the ability to shift. You have to pull the transmission, separate the case halves, and reattach the shift gate with the bolts Loctited and torqued to spec. Common issue. So if you're driving along one day and the car gets stuck in gear and you try and do a detent reset and it doesn't work, or if you can you can shift only in a couple of gears and then eventually those gears stop working, 90% of the time it's the shift gate. It'll usually get stuck in one gear. You can move the shifter around. It's like there's nothing there because there's no longer the gate, which actually engages the shift forks, working inside of the transmission. So that's, or transaxle. That's another common issue. Another pretty common issue is really high sensitivity to ignition components. You want to use either Denso TT dual platinum plugs or NGK ZRM, I believe, 6F11s are the factory ones. If you're running high boost, you want to drop it to a 7F11, which is a step colder plug. And you want to use either factory spark plug wires or NGK Blue spark plug wires. Those are the best options I've found. I've used a lot of different sets, and most of them were even the Denso spark plug wires. They just didn't take the heat from the turbo very well. So that's another thing. And then today, lastly, how about when you replace the axles? A common problem a lot of people will have is not being able to get the driver's side axle out of the transaxle. The reason being is because 90% of the time the axle has been replaced with an aftermarket unit, and the circlip that goes inside of the transaxle to hold the axle in place is the incorrect size. So if you're running factory axles and you have it go bad and you pull those axles out to replace them, reuse the circlip that's on the driver's side axle, or you will have nothing but problems in the future getting that axle out. With my Mazda 626, it took me 4 days and 4 different skilled mechanic friends of mine before we were finally able to get it out, and we almost broke the differential case part of the transaxle doing it. So that's going to conclude today's episode of Brandon's Tech Tips. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and share if you know anybody in the Mazda GD community. And thank you for watching.